The divorce papers trembled in my hand as I watched my husband's face. Not from grief or regret, but from the effort it took not to smile. "I'm taking all my personal belongings with me," I said evenly. His mistress sighed, admiring my designer home, unaware of what tomorrow would bring. Empty houses tell no lies. The heavy stack of legal documents hit the imported Italian marble kitchen island with a sharp smack that echoed through the massive room. I stared at the thick white paper, the bold black ink spelling out the end of a 5-year marriage, and then slowly shifted my gaze upward to look at the man I had married. Deon was standing on the other side of the counter. He was not looking at me with any sense of sorrow or hesitation. Instead, he was looking at me with a smug, overwhelming sense of victory. He was struggling to hide the arrogant, self-satisfied smile that kept pulling at the corners of his mouth. I stood perfectly still in the center of the kitchen, feeling the cold air conditioning against my skin. Valerie was standing right behind him. She was 10 years younger than me, a junior assistant at his wealth management firm, who had apparently decided to manage his personal assets as well. She was physically wearing my custom silk robe, the specific emerald green one I had imported from a boutique in Milan last summer. She was leaning casually against the stainless steel refrigerator, holding one of my crystal champagne flutes in her manicured hand. She took slow, deliberate sips of the expensive vintage champagne, looking at me with pure, unadulterated condescension. She had not even bothered to put on proper clothes before coming downstairs to witness my dismissal. She wanted me to know she had been in my bed. She wanted me to feel the sting of being replaced. Deon crossed his arms over his chest, his expensive tailored navy suit pulling tight across his broad shoulders. He loved playing the role of the affluent Atlanta wealth management consultant. He loved the image of absolute power and unstoppable success. He looked me up and down with an expression of sheer disgust, as if I were a piece of trash that had somehow blown into his pristine sanctuary. "You are just a low-ambition artist, Aaliyah," he said, his voice dripping with venom and superiority. "You run a tiny boutique art gallery downtown that barely turns a profit. You simply do not fit into my world anymore. I need a woman who truly understands high society Atlanta. I need someone who can stand beside me at high-profile corporate galas without looking like she just finished painting a canvas in a dusty, poorly lit studio." Valerie understands the corporate grind. She understands what a man of my stature truly needs to succeed and elevate his brand. I listened to his cruel words, letting them wash over me without showing a single ounce of the emotion he was desperately trying to provoke. For 5 long years, I had listened to Deon brag to anyone who would listen about how he carried me financially. He loved telling our wealthy friends and business associates that he had rescued me from a mediocre, directionless life. He loved playing the generous savior. He constantly reminded me, both in public and in private, that he paid for this sprawling $3 million mansion, that he single-handedly funded my humble little gallery, and that without his endless generosity I would be absolutely nothing. He masked his deep resentment of my quiet independence behind a loud, obnoxious display of financial dominance. He needed to be the sole provider because his fragile ego simply could not handle anything else. He needed to feel like an absolute king, and he needed me to play the role of the eternally grateful peasant who relied on his every whim. "I want you out of my house today," Deon demanded, pointing a freshly manicured finger toward the massive oak front doors. "I am completely tired of looking at you. Pack whatever cheap, ordinary clothes you brought into this marriage and leave immediately. This is my property. My name is on the lease agreement. Valerie is moving in her things tonight. We have very important high-net-worth guests coming over this weekend for a celebration, and I do not want your depressing, low-class energy ruining our vibe." Valerie giggled a high, irritating sound and took another sip of champagne. She walked over to Deon and wrapped her delicate arm around his waist, pressing a theatrical kiss to his cheek. She looked directly at me and smiled a venomous, victorious smile. Deon reached into his tailored suit jacket pocket and pulled out a thick stack of cash. He peeled off 10 crisp $100 bills and threw them across the wide marble island. The bills scattered wildly, some fluttering down to land on the polished hardwood floor at my feet. "Consider that a generous parting gift," he sneered, his eyes filled with mockery. Use it to call an Uber and get back to whatever average neighborhood you came from. Do not ever say I never took care of you. I looked down at the money scattered on the floor. I did not cry. I did not scream in frustration. I did not throw the heavy crystal glass at his head, even though a small, primal part of me desperately wanted to see it shatter against his perfect jawline. Instead, I simply bent down, gathered the $100 bills with smooth, deliberate movements, and neatly folded them into the pocket of my slacks. I looked up and gave him a bright, genuinely amused smile. "You are absolutely right, Deon," I said, keeping my voice perfectly even, calm, and void of any sorrow. "I will only take the things that legally belong to me. Enjoy your evening in this beautiful home." I turned my back on them and walked out of the kitchen. I did not rush. I walked with my head held high, my heels clicking rhythmically and confidently against the expensive flooring. I walked out the heavy front doors and stepped into the warm, humid Atlanta evening air. I pulled my phone from my purse and dialed a specific number I knew by heart. Elias answered on the second ring, his voice sharp and professional. "It is done," I said, staring back at the towering, beautifully lit mansion that I secretly owned. "Activate the eviction protocol immediately." The following morning, I was quietly packing the trunk of my car in the wide circular driveway of the mansion. I had gathered a few suitcases of basic clothing, leaving behind all the lavish gifts Deon had supposedly bought for me over the years. As I closed the trunk, a sleek silver Porsche and a luxury SUV suddenly turned into the driveway, speeding up the paved incline before coming to a screeching halt right behind my vehicle. The doors flew open, and my soon-to-be former-in-laws stepped out, their faces practically glowing with malicious joy. Patricia, my mother-in-law, stepped out of the SUV wearing a tailored cream pantsuit and an oversized sun hat. She had always been a woman obsessed with status and pedigree, constantly bragging about her family's long history in Atlanta's elite circles. From the day Deon brought me home, Patricia had made it her personal mission to remind me that my background was too humble, too ordinary, and completely beneath her son's magnificent potential. Jasmine, Deon's younger sister, hopped out of the passenger side clutching a brand new designer handbag that Deon had undoubtedly paid for. She was spoiled, entitled, and completely dependent on her brother's supposed wealth. And then there was Connor. Jasmine's husband stepped out of the driver's seat of the Porsche, adjusting his expensive sunglasses. Connor was a white, arrogant crypto investor who had married into this wealthy black family with the distinct intention of using their connections and money to fund his highly volatile business ventures. He always carried himself with a sickening air of superiority, frequently delivering backhanded compliments and subtle microaggressions masked as business advice. He thought he was the smartest man in any room he walked into. "Well, well, well," Patricia sang out, clapping her hands together in mock delight. "Look who is finally vacating the premises." I told Deon 5 years ago that a simple florist and art peddler would never be able to keep up with a man of his caliber. He needs a woman with real ambition, a woman with a proper pedigree. I am just thrilled he finally woke up and saw the light. Jasmine laughed loudly, leaning against the SUV. "Valerie is already picking out new curtains for the master bedroom," she said, her voice dripping with spite. "She actually understands how to host a proper society dinner. We are popping champagne inside to celebrate Deon dropping the dead weight." I stood silently by my car watching them gloat. I felt no urge to defend myself against their pathetic cruelty. I simply zipped my jacket and prepared to open my car door. But Connor could not resist the opportunity to exert his perceived dominance. He strolled over to my car, leaning his weight casually against the roof of my vehicle, intentionally blocking my path to the driver's seat. He looked down at me with a condescending smirk that made my stomach turn. "You really should look at this as a learning experience, Aaliyah," Connor said, using that slow, patronizing tone he always reserved specifically for me. "You should be endlessly grateful that Deon elevated you from the hood and gave you a taste of the good life for a few years. But the corporate world, the world of real money and real power, it is just too complex for someone with your limited background to understand. You got to experience luxury, but now it is time to return to reality. The world out there is extremely harsh for people who do not have a strong financial safety net. Try not to end up totally broke. He chuckled at his own terrible advice, expecting me to lower my head in shame. Patricia and Jasmine nodded in agreement, waiting for my tears. They thrived on watching me shrink. They needed me to be weak so they could feel powerful. I looked at Connor's smug face, noting the slight sweat on his brow, despite the cool morning breeze. I slowly reached out and firmly pushed his arm off the roof of my car. I stepped right into his personal space, forcing him to stand up straight. I looked him dead in the eyes, my expression completely void of fear or intimidation. "You really should check your Vanguard crypto portfolio this morning, Connor," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerously quiet register. It is a terrible shame how fast fake wealth evaporates when the market corrects itself. Connor's arrogant smirk instantly faltered, his eyes darting back and forth in sudden confusion. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words died in his throat. Patricia and Jasmine frowned, confused by my sudden shift in demeanor. Without another word, I opened my car door, slid into the driver's seat, started the engine, and drove smoothly down the long driveway, leaving them standing in the dust of their own ignorance. Midnight found me sitting in the plush leather chair of a high-rise corner office in downtown Atlanta. The room smelled of expensive mahogany and fresh espresso. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a stunning panoramic view of the sparkling city skyline, a city that I quietly owned a massive piece of. Elias Crawford, my brilliant, ruthless corporate attorney, sat across from me behind a massive wooden desk. He was organizing a thick stack of legal documents, his face a mask of intense concentration and professional lethal intent. The truth of my existence was documented entirely within the pages resting on Elias's desk. Deon did not own the $3 million mansion he had just violently kicked me out of. He had never owned it. He had been paying a highly structured rent-to-own lease agreement every single month for the past 5 years. The company he wrote those massive checks to was a private equity and real estate trust called Vanguard Holdings. And I, Aaliyah, the woman he had just degraded and discarded for being a low ambition, nobody, was the sole heir, primary shareholder, and acting CEO of Vanguard Holdings. My grandfather had built an absolute empire in commercial and residential real estate over 4 decades of grueling work. When he passed away, he left the entire kingdom to me, his only granddaughter. I had kept the magnitude of my wealth a complete secret when I married Deon. I knew from the very beginning that Deon suffered from a dangerously fragile ego. He desperately needed to feel like the dominant provider, the alpha male who controlled the finances and rescued his wife. To keep the peace in my marriage, I played the role he demanded. I managed my boutique art gallery as a passion project, while Elias and my board of directors handled the heavy lifting of Vanguard Holdings under strict non-disclosure agreements. But Deon was not just arrogant, he was completely financially incompetent. "He is currently 4 months behind on his lease payments," Elias stated flatly, tapping a manicured finger against a financial ledger. "We ran a quiet audit on his personal accounts yesterday. He has completely drained his liquid savings to purchase a new sports car and a ridiculous amount of diamond jewelry for his young assistant. He is broke, Aaliyah. He is essentially running on credit fumes and loud confidence. He literally cannot afford the house he just kicked you out of." I leaned back in my chair, swirling the hot coffee in my mug. The audacity of the man was staggering. He had thrown me out of my own property using money he did not even have to impress a mistress who only wanted him for his fake wealth. Elias reached for his tablet and slid it across the mahogany desk toward me. "You should see this," he said, a grim smile touching his lips. "He posted it an hour ago." I looked at the illuminated screen. It was an Instagram post from Deon's public profile. The photo showed Deon and Valerie standing in the grand foyer of my mansion. Valerie was wearing a stunning new cocktail dress and holding up her hand to display a massive, gaudy diamond engagement ring. The caption read, "Hosting the biggest engagement and housewarming party of the year this Saturday. Celebrating new beginnings, real love, and the ultimate Atlanta luxury lifestyle. Only the city's finest elite are invited. He was hosting a party. He was inviting his high net worth wealth management clients, his investors, and his entire toxic family to show off a mansion that belonged to my company using funds he had likely stolen from somewhere else to cater the event. He wanted to cement his status as Atlanta's premier wealth consultant by using my property as his personal stage. I stared at the photo for a long time, feeling a cold, precise wave of absolute focus wash over my mind. The time for playing the quiet, supportive wife was officially over. I reached into my purse, pulled out my favorite luxury pen, and looked up at Elias. Draft the paperwork immediately, I instructed, my voice hard and resolute. Prepare the official 24-hour eviction notice for severe breach of contract and failure to pay rent. Elias nodded, his eyes gleaming with anticipation. When do you want him served? I smiled, imagining the lavish party, the clinking glasses, the arrogant speeches, and the gathering of all the people who had mocked me for 5 years. I want him served this Saturday night, I commanded smoothly. I want the papers handed to him right in the middle of his grand engagement toast. Let the entire city see exactly who truly owns the keys to the kingdom. The city of Atlanta stretched out beneath me. I sat perfectly still in the plush leather chair of a high-rise corner office in the financial district. The air in the room smelled richly of fresh espresso and expensive leather. Elias Crawford sat across from me behind a massive solid wood desk. He was my brilliant and utterly ruthless corporate attorney. He carefully organized a thick stack of legal documents with precise movements. His face was a mask of intense concentration and professional lethal intent. The absolute truth of my entire existence was documented perfectly within the pages resting on his desk. Deon did not own the $3 million mansion he had just violently kicked me out of. He had been paying a highly structured rent-to-own lease agreement every single month for the past 5 years. The company he wrote those massive checks to was a private equity and real estate trust called Vanguard Holdings. And I was the sole heir, primary shareholder, and acting chief executive officer of Vanguard Holdings. The woman Deon had just degraded and discarded for being a low ambition, nobody was actually his landlord. My grandfather had built an absolute empire in commercial and residential real estate over 4 decades of work. When he passed away, he left the entire kingdom to me, his only granddaughter. I had kept the sheer magnitude of my wealth a secret when I married Deon. I knew from the very beginning that Deon suffered from a fragile ego. He desperately needed to feel like the alpha male who controlled the finances and rescued his wife. To keep the peace in my marriage, I played the exact role he demanded, managed my boutique art gallery as a quiet passion project, while Elias and my board of directors handled the heavy lifting of Vanguard Holdings under strict non-disclosure agreements. But Deon was not just arrogant, he was financially incompetent. He is currently 4 months behind on his lease payments, Elias stated flatly. He tapped a manicured finger against a detailed financial ledger. We ran a quiet audit on his personal accounts yesterday morning. He has completely drained his liquid savings to purchase diamond jewelry for his young assistant. He is broke. Aaliyah, he is essentially running on credit fumes and loud, unearned confidence. He literally cannot afford the house he just kicked you out of. I leaned back in my chair. The sheer audacity of the man was staggering. He had thrown me out of my own property using money he did not even have just to impress a mistress who only wanted him for his fake wealth. He had spent years making me feel small so he could feel tall standing on a foundation I secretly built and paid for. Elias reached for his tablet and slid it across the desk toward me. "You really should see this," he said. A smile touched his lips. He posted it an hour ago, and it is already gaining traction. I looked down at the screen. It was a social media post from Deon profile. The photo showed Deon and Valerie standing intimately together in the grand foyer of my mansion. Valerie was wearing a cocktail dress and holding up her left hand to proudly display a diamond engagement ring. The caption beneath the photo read, hosting the biggest engagement and housewarming party of the year this Saturday. Celebrating new beginnings, real love, and the ultimate Atlanta luxury lifestyle. Only the city, finest, elite are invited. I read the words, letting the reality of his delusions sink into my mind. He was hosting a party. He was actively inviting his clients, his business investors, and his entire toxic family to show off a mansion that belonged to my company. He was undoubtedly planning to use funds he had likely stolen or borrowed from somewhere else to cater the extravagant event. He wanted to cement his status as Atlanta premier wealth consultant by using my personal property as his stage. He wanted to parade his new mistress around the home my grandfather wealth had secured. I stared at the photo for a long time. I felt a cold, precise wave of absolute focus wash over my mind. The time for playing the quiet, supportive wife was officially over. I was no longer the humble florist or the struggling artist he could easily discard. I reached into my purse and pulled out my favorite luxury pen. The heavy metal felt perfect and grounding in my hand. I looked up and met Elias' expectant gaze. "Draft the paperwork immediately," I instructed. My voice was resolute, filling the quiet office. "Prepare the 24-hour eviction notice for severe breach of contract and repeated failure to pay rent. Add in the unauthorized occupant clause since he moved Valerie in without landlord approval." Elias nodded, his eyes gleaming with professional anticipation. He pulled a blank authorization form from his meticulously organized stack. "When do you want him served?" he asked. I smiled, imagining the lavish upcoming party. I pictured the clinking crystal glasses, the arrogant speeches, and the gathering of all the pretentious people who had mocked me for 5 years. I pictured Connor and Patricia and Jasmine standing in my foyer drinking champagne. They did not buy to celebrate a life they did not earn. "I want him served this Saturday night," I commanded smoothly, as I pressed the pen to the paper. "I want the eviction papers handed directly to him right in the middle of his grand engagement toast. Let the entire city see exactly who truly owns the keys to the kingdom." I signed my name with the swift, bold flourish. The ink dried instantly on the page, sealing Deon fate. Elias carefully took the document and placed it into a red folder. He leaned back in his chair and folded his hands together. "It will be my absolute pleasure to facilitate this transition," he said quietly. I stood up from the leather chair and smoothed the front of my jacket. The skyline behind me seemed to glow a little brighter as the early morning hours approached. Deon wanted a spectacular show for his elite guests, and I was going to give him an unforgettable performance. He thought he had buried me, but he had merely planted me in my own soil. Now it was time for the harvest. Saturday night arrived with the thick, humid heat that always blankets Atlanta in the late summer. I sat in the spacious back seat of a private black town car, watching the familiar wrought iron gates of my own property slowly come into view. The sprawling circular driveway was completely packed with high-end luxury vehicles. A team of hired valets in crisp white shirts rushed frantically back and forth trying to accommodate the massive influx of local high society guests. I looked down at my hands resting in my lap. I was not wearing the casual, comfortable artist clothes that Deon had spent 5 years mocking. Tonight I was wearing a sharp, impeccably tailored $5,000 Tom Ford power suit. The dark, charcoal fabric felt like absolute armor against my skin. The sharp cut of the shoulders and the sleek lines of the trousers projected an aura of undeniable authority. I felt powerful. I felt ready. Elias sat quietly beside me in the dim light of the vehicle. He held the bright red legal folder resting on his knees. That simple folder contained the absolute destruction of Deon and his carefully constructed reality. The heavy, rhythmic bass of music thumped through the thick wooden front doors of the mansion, vibrating into the quiet street. We pulled up to the main entrance, and the car came to a smooth stop. 2 armed sheriff deputies were already standing near the towering stone columns of the porch, just as Elias had arranged. They looked serious and imposing in their dark uniforms, with their hands resting casually near their utility belts. We had briefed them earlier on the exact legal parameters of this specific eviction. I stepped out of the town car, and the cool night air washed over my face. We walked deliberately up the grand stone steps. One of the hired valets stepped forward and tried to stop us, holding up his hand to ask for our invitations. The senior deputy simply flashed his silver badge and gently but firmly pushed the valet aside. The deputy reached out and pushed the heavy double doors wide open without knocking. The grand foyer was absolutely packed with the city elite. Wealthy women in expensive cocktail dresses and men in tailored, bespoke suits stood in small groups holding crystal glasses filled with the premium champagne my money had indirectly purchased. The sudden, forceful opening of the front doors caused an immediate ripple of silence to spread rapidly through the crowded room. The lively chatter died down instantly as people turned their heads to see who was interrupting the lavish celebration. Deon was standing exactly where I expected him to be. He was positioned halfway up the sweeping mahogany staircase, looking down at his guests like a conquering king. He held a glass of champagne raised high in the air, catching the light from the massive crystal chandelier above. Valerie stood one step below him, wearing a tight designer dress, gazing up at his face with an expression of manufactured adoration. Deon was right in the middle of a pompous, deeply arrogant speech. His voice echoed through the high ceilings, completely saturated with unearned confidence. He was loudly crediting his own relentless grind, his brilliant financial mind, and his unparalleled business acumen for his magnificent lifestyle. He told the gathered crowd of investors and prospective clients that true generational wealth was only built by those who were never afraid to aggressively elevate their standards. He swept his arm outward, gesturing to the immaculate architecture of the foyer. He claimed that this massive estate was a direct testament to his unstoppable success in the competitive wealth management sector. He spoke about new beginnings and finding a partner who truly understood the demands of a high-power corporate empire while smiling down at Valerie. Then his eyes shifted across the crowd and landed squarely on me standing in the doorway. The smug, triumphant smile vanished from his face in a fraction of a second. It was instantly replaced by a deep, flushed color of panicked anger. He gripped the wooden staircase railing so tightly his knuckles turned white. The crowd of guests parted automatically like the Red Sea as I walked slowly and deliberately into the center of the foyer. Elias walked closely on my left side, and the two uniformed deputies flanked my right, forming an impenetrable physical wall of legal authority. Deon tried desperately to quickly recover his composure in front of his wealthy clients. He forced a harsh, patronizing laugh that echoed awkwardly in the sudden silence of the room. He pointed a shaking finger at me from his elevated position on the stairs. "What the hell do you think you are doing here, Aaliyah?" Deon shouted, trying to project dominance. His voice cracked slightly, betraying his internal panic. "Security, get in here right now and remove this woman." Two private security guards in black suits stepped forward from the edges of the room, but they immediately froze and backed away when they saw the armed county deputies standing right beside me. Deon realized his guards were useless and his anger boiled over. He looked at the crowd and tried to spin the narrative to save his precious reputation. "I apologize for this ridiculous interruption," everyone, Deon announced loudly, forcing a fake sympathetic sigh. "This is my delusional broke ex-wife. She has been struggling with a severe mental breakdown since I filed for divorce, and clearly she is trying to ruin my private celebration because she cannot handle the reality that I have moved on. I want her removed from my property immediately before she causes a violent scene." The entire party was dead silent. Every single guest watched the drama unfold with wide, fascinated eyes, holding their breath. I glanced to the side and saw Patricia and Jasmine standing near the custom marble bar, looking completely horrified by my sudden intrusion. Connor was standing right beside them, swirling his drink and smirking. He clearly thought I was about to be publicly humiliated, dragged away in handcuffs, and thrown onto the street for trespassing. I did not raise my voice. I did not show a single ounce of anger, frustration, or sadness. I completely ignored Deon's frantic, pathetic shouting. I kept my posture perfectly straight and my expression entirely composed. I turned my attention away from the man on the stairs and looked directly at the senior deputy standing attentively at my right side. I reached my hand out and Elias smoothly placed the open red folder into my palm. I pulled out the original certified property deed with the urgent emergency eviction mandate securely attached to the front. I held the documents out, presenting them clearly to the officer. The heavy silence in the room amplified my words, making them ring out with absolute crystal clarity. Officer, please explain to my ex-husband exactly whose private property he is currently trespassing on. The senior deputy took the red folder from my outstretched hand. He opened it slowly, and his eyes scanned the thick black text of the certified legal documents. He looked up at Deon, who was still gripping the mahogany railing of the staircase with white knuckles. The deputy cleared his throat, and his deep, authoritative voice easily carried across the absolute dead silence of the grand foyer. "Sir, you are not the legal owner of this estate," the deputy announced. "According to these authenticated county records, you are currently occupying this property under a rent-to-own lease agreement managed by Vanguard Holdings. Furthermore, this document is a court-ordered 24-hour emergency eviction notice. You are currently $80,000 in arrears. The property owner standing right here has explicitly requested your immediate removal from the premises." The collective gasp from the gathered elite of Atlanta was deafening. The immaculate facade Deon had spent 5 years meticulously building shattered into a million irreparable pieces in a matter of seconds. Whispers erupted among the wealthy clients and prominent investors. High society wives leaned into their husbands, rapidly exchanging shocked murmurs. Cell phones began to emerge from expensive clutch purses and tailored jacket pockets as the city's most influential people eagerly hit record to capture the spectacular downfall of their supposed financial guru. "That is a complete and utter lie," Patricia shrieked from the back of the room. She pushed her way through the crowd of stunned guests, waving her hands frantically. Her oversized sun hat had been discarded, and her perfectly styled hair was beginning to unravel. "My son bought this house with his own money. He used the trust fund his father left him. He is a highly successful chief executive officer, and this woman is just a bitter, jealous florist trying to embarrass our family." I turned to face my former mother-in-law and allowed a cool, merciless smile to spread across my face. I had waited half a decade to shatter her towering delusions of grandeur. "Deon never had a trust fund, Patricia," I stated clearly, making sure my voice carried over the murmuring crowd. "His father left you both with nothing but credit card debt and a moderately priced retirement home in the suburbs. The money Deon has been aggressively spending to maintain this ridiculous billionaire lifestyle did not come from his brilliant financial investments. It came from you. He secretly convinced you to sign away the equity on your retirement home last year, and he has completely blown through every single penny of that remortgage to buy imported sports cars and diamond necklaces for his young assistant over there. You are practically homeless and you do not even know it yet." Patricia's face lost all color entirely. She stared at me in sheer horror and then slowly turned her wide, panicked eyes toward her son. Deon could not look at her. He stared down at his expensive leather shoes, completely unable to deny the devastating truth I had just exposed to his entire social circle. The heavy implication of my words suddenly hit the other side of the room like a physical shockwave. Connor had been standing near the custom marble bar swirling his drink, but the glass now slipped from his hand and shattered loudly against the floor. He aggressively pushed his way past his crying wife Jasmine and marched directly toward the bottom of the grand staircase. His face was a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. "Wait a damn minute," Connor yelled, pointing a shaking finger up at Deon. "If you are actually broke and you have been using your mother's retirement money to pay for this fake lifestyle, then where the hell is the $500,000 I gave you to invest last month?" Deon swallowed hard, stepping backward up the stairs. "Connor, we can talk about the market fluctuations in private," he stammered, holding his hands up defensively. "It is just a temporary liquidity issue." "It was a Ponzi scheme," Connor roared. "You used my investment capital to pay off your mounting debts and buy jewelry for your mistress." Connor did not wait for an explanation. He lunged up the wooden stairs and violently grabbed Deon by the collar of his tailored navy suit. The two men crashed against the ornate railing, grappling and shouting obscenities at each other. Jasmine began screaming hysterically from the bottom of the stairs, begging someone to pull them apart. The elite party guests scrambled backward to avoid the sudden outbreak of physical violence, but their cell phone cameras remained pointed directly at the pathetic brawl. The fragility of alliances built entirely on greed and fake prestige was fully exposed. The moment the money disappeared, they instantly turned on each other like starving animals. The two sheriff deputies immediately rushed the staircase to break up the fight, but I did not bother watching the humiliating scuffle. My eyes were actively scanning the chaotic room, looking for the one person who had suddenly gone missing. Valerie was no longer standing on the stairs. She had quietly slipped away the moment she realized her wealthy prince was actually a broke, desperate fraud facing imminent criminal charges. I turned smoothly on my heel and walked purposefully through the formal dining room, heading straight for the rear exit that led to the private garage. One of the deputies, having successfully subdued Deon, noticed my departure and quickly followed a few steps behind me to ensure my safety. I pushed open the heavy kitchen doors and stepped into the dimly lit rear hallway, just in time to see Valerie frantically struggling to open the back door. She was clutching 3 massive designer bags, awkwardly stuffed with items, trying desperately to flee the sinking ship before the financial consequences could trap her. I stepped forward and firmly placed my hand flat against the heavy wooden door, forcefully pushing it shut, right in her face. I blocked her only path to escape and stood tall, flanked by the imposing uniformed deputy. "Not so fast, Valerie," I commanded in a low, terrifyingly calm tone. "Those bags you are holding were purchased using a Vanguard Holdings corporate credit card that Deon physically stole from my private desk drawer. Everything you are wearing belongs to my company." Valerie stared at me with wide, terrified eyes, clutching the expensive leather bags tightly to her chest. She looked like a cornered thief, completely stripped of her previous arrogant confidence. "Take off the Hermes bag," I instructed, pointing to her shoulder. "Take off the designer shoes and unfasten the Cartier watch. You can keep the cheap slip dress underneath, but everything else stays exactly where it belongs, right here in my house, now." The heavy glass doors of the executive conference room swung open, exactly 12 minutes past the scheduled meeting time. Deon walked into the pristine space, carrying himself with that same manufactured swagger he always used to mask his deep internal insecurities. He was wearing a different tailored suit today, but the dark gray fabric looked distinctly rumpled around the edges. It was clear he had spent the weekend sleeping in whatever cheap roadside motel his drained credit cards could still afford. A man followed closely behind him, clutching a heavily scuffed leather briefcase. The lawyer had a slick, predatory appearance with slicked-back hair and shifty eyes. He looked exactly like the kind of attorney who specialized in aggressive, unfounded settlements and loud, empty threats. They took their seats on the opposite side of the massive, polished glass table. Elias sat perfectly still beside me, with his hands neatly folded over a single manila file. I sat quietly in my ergonomic chair and watched Deon survey the expansive room with absolute disdain. He completely ignored the quiet, unassuming man in a plain brown suit who was sitting in the far corner of the room reading a financial newspaper. Deon leaned back in his leather chair and crossed his arms over his chest. He looked at me with a potent mixture of sheer hatred and profound, unearned arrogance. "I want $50 million, Deon stated, his deep voice echoing aggressively off the acoustic ceiling panels. He leaned forward and placed both of his hands flat on the cold glass table. "You humiliated me in front of my most important clients, and you locked me out of my own business premises. I know exactly how much Vanguard Holdings is worth. Since we built this massive empire together over the last 5 years, I am legally entitled to half of everything you currently own. 50 million is a significant discount, but I am willing to walk away quietly if you transfer the funds into my account immediately." The sleazy lawyer nodded eagerly and pulled a thick stack of printed demands from his battered briefcase. "My client is offering a very generous and efficient settlement," the lawyer said. "If we are forced to take this matter before a judge, we will file injunctions to freeze all Vanguard Holdings accounts during the discovery phase. We will drag your corporate reputation through the dirt and ensure your board of directors removes you for gross misconduct. It would be significantly cleaner and much cheaper for you to simply write the check today and allow my client to rebuild his life." I did not react to their pathetic, desperate threats. I simply looked over at Elias. My brilliant attorney did not even bother opening the red folder from Saturday night. Instead, he reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a single thick document bound by a dark blue legal ribbon. He slid the document across the smooth glass table. The heavy paper glided silently until it stopped right in front of Deon and his attorney. "You might want to actually read the paperwork you sign before demanding $50 million, Elias suggested. His voice was calm and entirely devoid of emotion. Deon looked down at the document, and his arrogant smirk began to fade into a look of genuine confusion. It was the prenuptial agreement we had signed 5 years ago. I clearly remembered the specific day we signed that exact paperwork. Deon had been so incredibly obsessed with protecting his own imaginary wealth that he demanded we sign an ironclad prenup to ensure I could never touch his non-existent trust fund. He believed I was a gold digger trying to secure my future through his fake success. He had brought the paperwork to my tiny art gallery and arrogantly slapped it onto my painting table. He bragged endlessly about how his massive wealth needed to be heavily protected. Because he always assumed he was the smartest man in every single room he entered, he never bothered to actually read the boring legal details hidden in the back pages of the document. He never realized that the contract Elias drafted explicitly and permanently protected all assets placed within Vanguard Holdings. The document entirely separated my corporate empire from any potential marital property claims. Deon frantically flipped through the pages. His eyes scanned the dense legal jargon with increasing desperation. The color slowly drained from his face as the crushing reality of his own catastrophic arrogance finally set in. The contract clearly stated that in the event of a divorce, neither party had any right to the corporate assets belonging to the other. He had willingly and legally signed away his right to my entire empire because he was too busy trying to protect a financial kingdom that never even existed. "This is completely invalid," Deon yelled. He slammed his closed fist onto the glass table, making the crystal water glasses rattle. "I was tricked into signing this garbage. You deliberately hid your vast wealth from me, and you maliciously manipulated the contract. No judge in this city will ever uphold a prenuptial agreement based on intentional deception. Your signature was witnessed and notarized by your own legal team 5 years ago," Elias countered smoothly. "You had every possible opportunity to read the document thoroughly, and you chose to focus entirely on your own grand illusions. You have absolutely no legal claim to Vanguard Holdings or any of its subsidiaries. You get nothing from this divorce except the massive personal debts you accumulated while trying to maintain your fake billionaire lifestyle." Deon stood up so fast his heavy leather chair crashed backward onto the floor. He pointed a shaking finger directly at my face, and his chest heaved with violent, angry breaths. "You think you have won?" he shouted. "You think a piece of paper is going to stop me from taking what I deserve? I will go to the press today. I will tell everyone in Atlanta how the chief executive officer of Vanguard Holdings treats her own family. I will completely ruin your corporate image, Aaliyah." I remained perfectly seated and simply smiled at his pathetic outburst. I reached out and poured myself a glass of water from the crystal pitcher resting on the table. I took a slow, deliberate sip before looking up at the furious, broken man towering over me. "You are not going to the press, Deon," I said, keeping my voice dangerously quiet and perfectly steady. "You are going to federal prison." I turned my head and gestured to the quiet, unassuming man sitting in the far corner of the room. The man slowly folded his financial newspaper and stood up. He calmly adjusted his gray suit jacket and walked deliberately toward the conference table. He reached into his pocket and placed a heavy metal flash drive directly next to Deon's empty hands. "Deon," I said calmly, "I would like you to meet Agent Hayes from the Securities and Exchange Commission. He has been sitting here very patiently listening to you attempt to extort me for $50 million. I just handed him the complete unredacted financial ledger, proving you have been running a massive illegal Ponzi scheme using your clients' retirement funds to pay for your mistress and your rented sports cars." Deon's face went completely white. His jaw dropped open, but he could not form a single coherent word. He looked down at the metal flash drive as if it were a live, ticking explosive. The sleazy lawyer sitting next to Deon suddenly realized the sheer magnitude of the criminal situation. He looked at Agent Hayes and then looked at the ironclad prenuptial agreement. The lawyer face contorted into pure, unadulterated panic. Without saying a single word, the lawyer rapidly shoved his loose papers back into his scuffed briefcase. He snapped the latches shut and practically ran out of the conference room. He left Deon completely and utterly alone to face the absolute destruction of his fake empire and the severe federal consequences of his overwhelming greed. The heavy frosted glass doors of my private executive office slid open. My security team had already alerted me that an unscheduled visitor was aggressively demanding a few minutes of my time. I did not look up from the architectural blueprints spread across my desk. I heard the sharp, frantic clicking of cheap heels against the polished hardwood floor. Valerie stood in the center of the expansive room, breathing heavily. She looked absolutely nothing like the arrogant, glamorous woman who had strutted through my kitchen just a few days ago, wearing my custom silk robe and sipping my vintage champagne. The expensive designer illusions were completely stripped away. She was wearing faded denim jeans and a simple cotton blouse. Her hair was pulled back into a messy knot, and her face was void of the heavy, pristine makeup she usually wore to manipulate wealthy men. She clutched a small leather handbag tightly to her chest, looking around the massive corporate office with wide, nervous eyes. I slowly rolled up my blueprints and placed them into a leather cylindrical tube. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair and folded my hands, resting them on the smooth surface of my desk. I did not offer her a seat. I simply waited for her to speak. "I know exactly what you are doing to Deon," Valerie said, her voice shaking slightly. "I saw the news about the federal investigation. I know he is completely ruined, and he is going to federal prison for a very long time." I maintained my silence. I let the quiet atmosphere of the room press down on her, forcing her to fill the uncomfortable void. "I can help you absolutely destroy him," Valerie continued, stepping closer to the desk. She reached into her small handbag and pulled out a sleek, black metal flash drive. She held it up tightly between her fingers. "He is an arrogant fool who thought he was a criminal mastermind. When he was sleeping or drinking too much, I spent months digging through his private laptop and his locked briefcases. I downloaded everything I have, the exact routing numbers and the encrypted passwords to his hidden offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. He has been funneling the stolen client funds out of the country for over a year, preparing a massive safety net for himself. He never trusted anyone, but he was careless enough to leave his digital vaults unlocked around me, because he thought I was just a stupid, beautiful assistant who only cared about shopping." She placed the black metal flash drive directly onto the center of my desk. It landed with a soft clink. "I never loved him, Aaliyah," Valerie stated, her tone shifting into a cold, calculating business register. "Our entire relationship was a highly structured financial transaction. He needed a gorgeous young trophy to boost his pathetic, fragile ego, and I needed a wealthy sponsor to elevate my social standing in Atlanta. It was a mutual agreement built entirely on greed. But now he is absolutely useless to me. He cannot pay my rent, and he cannot buy me the lifestyle he promised. I am not going down with a sinking ship. I am offering you the final nail in his coffin. I will gladly testify against him in federal court, and I will hand over this drive right now." I looked at the flash drive resting on the polished wood. I looked back up at the young, desperate woman standing before me. She was so incredibly certain that she had the upper hand. She truly believed she had walked into my corporate headquarters with ultimate leverage. "And what exactly is your price for this sudden burst of civic duty?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly even and entirely composed. $100,000, Valerie demanded without a single second of hesitation. She lifted her chin, trying to project a sense of power she simply did not possess. "I need a clean break and enough capital to leave the state and start over somewhere else. 50,000 wired immediately into my account, and the remaining 50,000 the day I take the witness stand. It is a tiny drop in the bucket for Vanguard Holdings, and it guarantees you recover the millions he tried to hide overseas." I slowly reached out and picked up the black metal flash drive. I turned it over in my fingers, feeling the smooth, cold surface. It was a fascinating display of pure, unadulterated opportunism. She had happily participated in draining the retirement accounts of innocent people, so she could wear diamond necklaces and post luxurious photos on social media. Now that the money had dried up, she was eager to sell out her former lover for a quick cash payout. I opened my top desk drawer and casually dropped the flash drive inside. I pushed the drawer shut until it clicked and locked securely. I leaned forward, resting my arms on the desk. "You seem to misunderstand the fundamental dynamics of this room, Valerie," I said, my voice dropping to a low, terrifyingly calm register. "You walked into my corporate headquarters and handed me stolen financial data, hoping to extort a massive payout. You assumed I would be so blinded by a desire for revenge that I would eagerly open my checkbook. But I do not need to buy leverage against a man who has already destroyed himself." Valerie frowned, her confident facade beginning to crack. "You cannot just take that drive," she stammered, taking a step backward. "That is my property. That is my leverage. We had a verbal agreement." "We have absolutely no agreement," I corrected her smoothly. "You are an admitted accomplice to massive federal wire fraud and embezzlement. You knowingly accepted and paraded around in stolen assets. The only reason you are standing in my office right now instead of sitting in a holding cell is because the federal authorities have not fully tracked the extent of your complicity yet." Her eyes widened in pure terror. The color completely drained from her face as the reality of her catastrophic miscalculation hit her. She reached her hand out toward my locked desk drawer, but quickly pulled it back, realizing she was completely powerless. "I do not negotiate with thieves," I stated firmly, "but I will let the Internal Revenue Service know you are cooperating." Valerie quickly realized she gets nothing. The wooden doors of my office pushed open barely an hour after Valerie fled. Connor marched into the room uninvited. He did not look like the smug investor who leaned against his sports car a few days ago. His face flushed with panic and entitlement. He slammed his palms down on my desk, leaning his weight forward in a pathetic attempt to intimidate me. "You are going to fix this massive problem right now, Aaliyah," Connor demanded, his voice echoing. "You are going to cut me a check for the $500,000 Deon stole from me right this second. Vanguard Holdings has enough liquid capital to cover my losses. You are responsible for making me whole." I looked at his sweating face and felt nothing but cold disgust. Connor had spent his entire life failing upward, shielded from the consequences of his own incompetence by the armor of his wealthy white family background. He believed he inherently deserved a massive return on every terrible investment he made. I slowly stood up from my chair and matched his aggressive posture. "I am not responsible for your lack of financial literacy." "Connor," I said, keeping my voice steady, "you willingly handed $500,000 to a man who ran a fake consulting firm out of a rented office. You did not run a background check because you were too busy trying to prove you were the smartest guy in the room. Your massive ego blinded you to a very obvious scam, and now you want a black woman to rescue you from your own glaring stupidity." Connor's face twisted into a snarl. He stepped around the desk. "You listen to me, you arrogant nobody," he threatened, his voice dropping low. "You think because you own a real estate trust that you run this city. My family has been operating in Atlanta for 4 generations. My father owns the largest logistics firm in the Southeast. We sit on the boards of banks. I can make one phone call and have Vanguard Holdings blackballed from every project. I will destroy your reputation and ensure you never close another deal unless you wire that money into my account today." He was leaning on the same tired playbook he had used his entire life. When his non-existent business skills failed him, he immediately ran to hide behind his daddy corporate shadow, threatening to use systemic power to crush anyone who did not cater to his demands. He expected me to cower under the weight of his generational connections and hand over my hard-earned money. I looked at him and let out a soft laugh. Connor's expression faltered as he realized his empty threats had zero effect on my composure. I picked up my office phone and pressed a single button connecting me directly to the executive boardroom downstairs, where my senior analysts were holding a strategic acquisition meeting. "Elias," I spoke clearly into the receiver. "Initiate the final phase of the logistics acquisition we discussed this morning. Execute the hostile takeover protocol and inform the board that we have secured the majority shareholder voting rights." I placed the receiver back onto the cradle and turned my attention back to the confused man standing in my office. Connor blinked rapidly, trying to process the corporate terminology I had just casually used. "You see, Connor?" I explained, my voice radiating absolute dominance while you were busy trying to play cryptocurrency millionaire using your wife family money. I was busy running a $1 billion private equity firm. My analysts noticed last quarter that your father logistics company was severely overleveraged and drowning in hidden commercial debt. He expanded too fast and took on high-interest loans he could not afford to repay. Connor took a slow, shaky step backward, the color draining from his face as the crushing reality began to set in. Vanguard Holdings bought up every one of your father's commercial debts through our subsidiary companies over the last 3 months. We now own the vast majority of his financial liabilities. We also spent the last 48 hours acquiring voting shares from his panicked board members. We secured the controlling interest in his logistics company at 9:00 this morning. I own your father, Connor. I own his legacy, his business, and his entire financial future. You are lying, Connor stammered, his voice shaking uncontrollably. You could not possibly pull off a hostile takeover that fast, as if timed by the universe. Connor's cell phone began to vibrate in his pocket. He scrambled to pull it out, his hands shaking so badly he nearly dropped the device. He stared at the caller identification screen, and his breath hitched in his throat. He slowly answered the call, putting the phone to his ear. "Dad?" Connor whispered, his voice cracking completely. Even from across the desk, I could clearly hear the voice of his father radiating through the phone speaker. The older man was screaming, hurling obscenities, and demanding to know what mess his son had caused this time. His father yelled that Vanguard Holdings had just seized control of their board of directors and demanded a complete restructuring of the executive leadership to avoid total bankruptcy. His father screamed that Connor was a useless failure who had finally brought down the family empire. "I am cutting you off, Connor!" His father roared through the phone, the words echoing in my office. "I am disowning you to protect whatever tiny fraction of this company I have left. Do not ever call me again, and do not come back to my house. You are entirely on your own." The line went dead, with a sharp final click. Connor slowly lowered the phone from his ear. His body seemed to deflate, crumbling under the weight of his own destruction. He looked at me with hollow, empty eyes, completely stripped of his white privilege, his unearned arrogance, and his fake corporate superiority. He was broken, reduced to absolutely nothing. I pointed my finger toward the doors of my office. The world out there is harsh for people who do not have a strong financial safety net. "Connor," I said, throwing his exact cruel words from the driveway right back into his face. "Try not to end up totally broke. Now get out of my building." The heavy mahogany doors of my private office opened slowly later that afternoon. My security team had called up 5 minutes earlier to inform me that another desperate family member was waiting in the lobby. I told them to send her up because I wanted to look her directly in the eye. Jasmine walked into the expansive room completely stripped of her usual arrogant swagger. The pampered, spoiled sister-in-law who had stood in my driveway sipping champagne and laughing at my eviction looked entirely defeated. Her expensive designer clothes were wrinkled, and she carried a plain canvas tote bag instead of the luxury leather purses her brother used to buy for her. She had dark circles under her eyes and her hands shook as she approached my polished desk. "Please, Aaliyah," Jasmine said, her voice cracking with manufactured emotion. "I really need your help." Connor emptied every single one of our joint bank accounts and fled the state. The bank served me with foreclosure papers this morning, and the angry creditors are calling my cell phone every 10 minutes. I have absolutely nothing left to my name. I sat perfectly still in my ergonomic chair and watched her crumble. I did not offer her a seat or a glass of water. I simply let her stand there in the center of the massive corporate office, bearing the full crushing weight of her own terrible life choices. "I need a job," Jasmine begged, stepping closer to the desk. "You run this massive empire now and you have hundreds of employees. You could easily give me a high-paying position here at Vanguard Holdings. We are family." "Aaliyah, We have always been sisters. I know we had our minor differences, but you are the only person who can save me from living on the streets." I looked at her tear-stained face and felt absolutely no sympathy. She was attempting to rewrite 5 years of systematic emotional abuse by pretending we had a complex but loving sisterly bond. She desperately wanted to erase the past because the miserable present was too difficult for her to handle. "We were never sisters, Jasmine," I stated, keeping my voice perfectly calm and flat. "We were simply two women who occupied the same house during family dinners. You never viewed me as family. You viewed me as a convenient punching bag to make your own pathetic dependent life feel slightly more glamorous." "That is not true," Jasmine cried, wiping a tear from her cheek. "I always cared about you deep down. Deon was just so incredibly controlling, and he made it exceedingly difficult for us to properly connect." "Do not try to blame your cruel behavior on your brother," I countered smoothly. "You made your own choices." I distinctly remember a family dinner 2 years ago. Deon threw a plate of hot food across the kitchen because he claimed the meal I cooked was entirely inadequate for a man of his immense corporate stature. He looked at me in front of you and your mother and called me completely useless. He said, "I was a heavy burden who contributed absolutely nothing to society." Jasmine flinched and looked down at the carpet, unable to meet my intense gaze. "You did not defend me." I continued my words, striking her like physical blows. "You did not tell him to stop." You looked at me and you laughed. You actually laughed out loud at my public humiliation. You sat at my dining table drinking expensive wine. I prepared, and you chuckled while your brother verbally degraded me. You fully participated in my destruction because it highly entertained you. "I was just trying to keep the peace." Jasmine sobbed into her hands. "I did not want to make him angry at me too." "You are an enabler, Jasmine," I said, leaning forward slightly. "You actively cheered for the villain because you thought the villain would always protect you and pay your endless bills. You happily co-signed every racist, classist insult your elitist mother threw at me. You smiled when your white husband delivered his arrogant microaggressions. You celebrated my pain because my pain purchased your designer handbags and your luxury vacations. You built your entire existence on a foundation of unearned privilege and malicious complicity." "Please, Aaliyah," Jasmine whispered. "I am begging you on my knees. I have nowhere else to go." "That is the direct consequence of burning every bridge to keep yourself warm," I replied coldly. "You chose your side on Saturday night when you stood in my driveway and popped champagne to celebrate my eviction. You made your bed, and now you are going to lose it to the bank. Vanguard Holdings only employs highly competent, trustworthy professionals. We do not run a charity for toxic enablers who suddenly discover their moral compass when they run out of cash." Jasmine stared at me with wide, terrified eyes. She finally realized that the quiet, submissive woman she had mocked for 5 years was completely gone. In her place sat a corporate titan who possessed absolutely no mercy for the people who had aggressively tried to break her. "Get out of my office, Jasmine," I commanded, pointing a manicured finger toward the heavy wooden doors. "Go find a minimum wage job and learn how the real world actually works." Jasmine let out a loud, pathetic sob. She turned around and practically ran out of the office, leaving a trail of broken entitlement in her wake. I watched the doors swing shut behind her and let out a slow, cleansing breath. The final piece of the toxic family structure had been completely dismantled and permanently discarded. I reached across my desk and picked up the remote control for the large flat-screen television mounted on the far wall. I pressed the power button, wanting to catch the afternoon financial market updates. The screen flickered to life and instantly displayed the local news channel. A bright red banner flashed across the bottom of the screen reading "Breaking News." I turned up the volume and watched the live helicopter footage broadcasting directly from the bustling tarmac of Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport. A prominent local wealth management consultant was taken into federal custody just moments ago, the news anchor announced breathlessly. The camera zoomed in on a chaotic scene near a private chartered jet. I saw Deon wearing a wrinkled gray suit running frantically across the sun-baked pavement. 3 unmarked black sport utility vehicles surrounded him completely, cutting off his only escape route. Federal agents in dark tactical gear swarmed the tarmac. Deon tried to aggressively push past them, but an agent violently tackled him to the ground. The camera clearly captured my ex-husband, terrified face pressed hard against the rough asphalt as the federal agents aggressively handcuffed him. He was trying to flee to Mexico to escape the massive fraud investigation, but his fake empire had finally collapsed right on top of him. The doors of the family courthouse swung shut, cutting off the chaotic noise of the hallway. I walked down the aisle, keeping my posture straight and my gaze fixed forward. The courtroom was sterile, a stark contrast to the luxurious environments where my ex-husband usually operated. I took my seat at the polished wooden table on the right. Elias sat immediately to my left, placing his organized briefcase onto the surface. He rested his hands on the table, projecting unshakable confidence. Deon was seated at the petitioner table on the opposite side. He was completely alone. He did not have a slick corporate lawyer whispering advice into his ear, because every reputable attorney in Atlanta had dropped him the second the federal investigation went public. The man who had spent 5 years mocking my clothing and parading around in bespoke fashion was now wearing a cheap, deeply wrinkled gray suit. The fabric hung awkwardly on his frame. He shifted in his seat, radiating a potent mixture of arrogant entitlement and pathetic desperation. Honorable Judge Montgomery entered the courtroom. She was a stern, sharp-eyed woman who had spent decades navigating the messy reality of contested divorces. She took her seat at the high bench, arranged her robes, and looked down at the two tables. She noted that Deon was representing himself, proceeding pro se because he simply had no other choice. He stood up quickly, adjusting his cheap tie, and attempted to flash the charming smile that used to win over clients. "Your Honor." Deon began, his voice echoing loudly. "I stand before you today as a man deeply and maliciously wronged by the woman sitting across from me. For 5 years, I dedicated my life to providing for her. I gave her a beautiful home and supported her dreams in return. She secretly hoarded a massive corporate empire. She intentionally hid assets while allowing me to shoulder the immense financial burden of our marital lifestyle. She set a trap, Your Honor, and waited until I was vulnerable to spring it." I sat in total silence and simply watched him speak. I allowed him to fill the sterile room with his profound delusions. Deon possessed a deeply narcissistic inability to accept even a fraction of accountability for his catastrophic choices. He stood in a court of law facing a judge who held his entire financial future in her hands, and he genuinely believed he could charm his way out of a mountain of documented fraud. "She forced me to sign a highly deceptive prenuptial agreement under the guise of protecting my modest assets," Deon continued. "She weaponized that trust to steal the best years of my life when the pressure of her emotional neglect became too much to bear. I admit, I sought comfort elsewhere, but my temporary indiscretion does not invalidate my legal right to the empire we built together. I respectfully request that the court invalidate the fraudulent prenuptial agreement and award me 50% of Vanguard Holdings as proper compensation." Judge Montgomery listened without showing a single trace of emotion on her face. She slowly opened the thick binder resting on her bench. Elias had submitted irrefutable evidence days prior to the hearing. The judge methodically turned the pages, reviewing the rent-to-own lease agreement, the stolen corporate credit card statements, and the detailed ledgers of the money Deon had aggressively funneled to his mistress. "I am a good man, Your Honor," Deon pleaded. Taking a step out from behind his table, he lowered his voice, attempting to sound vulnerable. "I know you are a fair and perceptive woman. You can clearly see the malicious intent here. She locked me out of my office. She humiliated me in front of my peers. She is trying to destroy me simply because she is bitter." Elias did not object. He merely leaned forward and quietly directed the judge to a specific tab in her binder. "Your Honor, if I may refer you to Exhibit 4, Elias stated smoothly. "It details the systematic diversion of $5 million in marital funds." Deon instantly snapped. His carefully constructed mask of vulnerability vanished, replacing it with the volatile, aggressive temper I knew all too well. "You shut your mouth!" Deon shouted, pointing a shaking finger at Elias. "She stole my life. You both manipulated the paperwork." "Mr. Crawford has the floor, sir," Judge, Montgomery stated, her voice cracking through the room like a physical whip. Step back behind your table immediately. Deon clenched his jaw and reluctantly stepped back. His chest heaving with suppressed rage, he glared at the judge, failing to realize that his sudden aggressive outburst had just confirmed every single claim of emotional volatility outlined in our divorce petition. I have thoroughly reviewed the extensive documentation provided by the respondent. Judge Montgomery announced, her sharp eyes locked directly onto Deon, silencing any further protests. I have read the prenuptial agreement, which was properly witnessed and notarized by your own legal counsel 5 years ago. I have also reviewed the financial records detailing your aggressive misappropriation of funds, your severe delinquency on rent payments for a property you never owned, and your extensive financial infidelity. Deon opened his mouth to argue, but the judge raised her hand, stopping him instantly. You stand in my courtroom and attempt to paint yourself as a victim of financial manipulation while actively hiding a massive web of deceit. Judge Montgomery continued, her tone absolutely scathing. You chose to sign a legally binding contract without reading it because of your own arrogance. You chose to drain retirement accounts and steal corporate funds to finance an illicit affair. You are not a victim, sir. You are an architect of your own total destruction. Deon's face went completely pale. He gripped the edges of his table knuckles, turning white, as the reality of the situation finally pierced his impenetrable ego. I am granting the petition for divorce immediately, the judge declared, bringing her wooden gavel down with a resounding crack. The prenuptial agreement is fully enforceable. Aaliyah retains 100% of her assets, including Vanguard Holdings. Furthermore, due to your egregious financial infidelity and documented theft, I am assigning 100% of the $5 million marital debt solely to you. Deon, this court is adjourned. 4 months passed before I found myself sitting in another sterile room, but the heavy oak paneling of the federal courthouse carried a much darker weight than the family court. The air was thick with the severe reality of federal prosecution. I sat in the second row of the gallery, flanked by Elias, watching the final day of the criminal trial for wire fraud and embezzlement. Deon sat at the defense table wearing an ill-fitting beige jumpsuit provided by the county holding facility. His posture was completely broken, his shoulders slumped forward as he stared at the digital monitors displaying his financial crimes to the jury. The federal prosecutor, a sharp woman with an unrelenting voice, stood before the jury box. She held the black metal flash drive I had originally secured from his former mistress. The prosecutor methodically walked the jurors through every single transaction, detailing exactly how Deon had aggressively siphoned millions of dollars from innocent investors. She displayed the encrypted bank statements showing the exact routing numbers he used to funnel money into offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. The evidence was absolutely irrefutable and heavily documented by the very ledgers Deon had so carelessly left unsecured. Across the aisle in the gallery sat Patricia. Her tailored suits and oversized sun hats had been replaced by a simple faded dress. She clutched a crumpled tissue in her trembling hands, weeping softly as the prosecutor laid out the sheer magnitude of her son and his corporate deception. She had attended every single day of the trial, clinging to the pathetic delusion that Deon was simply a victim of a corporate misunderstanding. She still desperately wanted to believe her golden child was innocent, and that I had somehow orchestrated this massive federal downfall. I watched Patricia cry and felt absolutely no sympathy. She was mourning the loss of her elevated social status, just as much as she was mourning her son. The prosecutor moved on to the final piece of evidence, displaying a series of forged electronic signatures Deon had utilized to authorize the final transfers of stolen wealth. He had knowingly liquidated the life savings of elderly clients to purchase the imported sports cars and the gaudy diamond rings that fueled his fragile ego. The jury watched the presentation with profound disgust, clearly repulsed by the sheer greed radiating from the man sitting at the defense table. The defense attorney, appointed by the state because Deon could no longer afford private counsel, offered a weak and unconvincing closing argument. He attempted to claim that Deon was simply a naive businessman who made unfortunate investments during a volatile market shift. But the jury was not swayed by the pathetic attempt to minimize his catastrophic financial crimes. The judge sent the jury to deliberate, and the courtroom fell into a tense, suffocating silence. It took the jury less than 3 hours to reach a unanimous decision. We all stood as they filed back into the room, their faces grim and resolute. The foreperson handed the folded paper to the bailiff, who passed it up to the federal judge. The judge opened the document and read the verdict aloud in a booming, authoritative voice. Guilty on all 14 counts of wire fraud, guilty on 6 counts of aggravated embezzlement, and guilty on 3 counts of money laundering. Deon closed his eyes and his head dropped heavily toward his chest. The final remnants of his fake empire completely evaporated into dust. Patricia let out a loud, agonizing wail from the gallery, burying her face in her hands. She sobbed uncontrollably, her cries echoing through the high ceilings of the courtroom as the reality of her son and his federal convictions finally shattered her deep delusions. The federal judge slammed his wooden gavel, demanding order in the court. He looked down at Deon with an expression of sheer, absolute contempt. Before we proceed to the formal sentencing next month, there is the matter of immediate financial restitution, the judge announced, his voice projecting across the silent room. Mr. Defendant, your actions represent some of the most abhorrent and predatory financial abuses this court has ever seen. You preyed upon vulnerable individuals who trusted you with their financial futures. You used their hard-earned money to finance a lifestyle of gross excess and extreme vanity. The judge picked up a separate legal document, adjusting his glasses. I am signing an immediate order for full and complete financial restitution to every single victim listed in the federal indictment, the judge declared. This includes the immediate liquidation of any remaining hidden assets and the garnishment of any future income you may ever generate. But there is one specific victim whose financial ruin requires special mention in this courtroom today. Deon slowly lifted his head, looking up at the judge with terrified, empty eyes. According to the federal financial audit, the judge continued, your largest single victim was not a corporate client. You knowingly and maliciously remortgaged a suburban retirement home and subsequently drained the entire life savings of an elderly woman, leaving her with absolutely zero financial safety net. You stole over $800,000 from your own mother, Patricia. The courtroom went completely dead silent. Every single person turned to look at Patricia sitting in the gallery. The older woman stopped crying, her hands falling away from her face as the judge's words struck her like a physical blow. She stared at the judge and then slowly turned her wide, horrified eyes toward her son, sitting at the defense table. She finally understood the absolute truth. Deon had not just made a few bad investments, he had intentionally and aggressively stolen her entire future to pay for his fake luxury life. She realized in that exact moment that she would die in absolute poverty because of the son she had blindly worshipped and enabled for 3 decades. The crushing weight of her imminent homelessness and total financial ruin slammed into her frail body. Patricia let out a strange, shallow gasp. Her eyes rolled back into her head, and she collapsed sideways in the wooden pew, fainting completely dead away. The courtroom erupted into sudden chaos. Medical personnel rushed into the gallery to attend to the unconscious woman laying across the wooden benches. Deon tried to stand up, calling out loudly to his mother, but the federal marshals immediately grabbed both of his arms. The heavy metal door of the federal holding room groaned as the armed bailiff pulled it open for me. The air inside the courthouse basement was stale and smelled of floor wax and defeat. I walked into the small concrete room, my heels clicking against the cold floor, taking deliberate steps forward. The space was entirely barren except for a bolted steel table and 2 rigid metal chairs. The sterile environment was a massive departure from the private dining rooms where my ex-husband used to hold court. I stood near the edge of the table, waiting quietly. Deon was escorted into the room by 2 towering federal marshals. The heavy chains around his ankles and wrists clinked loudly with every slow, shuffling step he took. The custom-tailored suits he once used to project his fake billionaire persona were gone forever, replaced entirely by a stiff, oversized beige federal inmate jumpsuit. His previously immaculate fade was overgrown and unkempt. His skin looked sallow, and the dark bags under his eyes revealed the sheer terror of his new reality. collapsed into the metal chair, looking absolutely nothing like the arrogant man who had thrown me out of my house. The marshals stepped back against the concrete walls, giving us a brief illusion of privacy. Deon looked up at me, and his eyes immediately filled with desperate, frantic tears. He began to weep, his shoulders shaking as he leaned forward against the cold steel table. He told me he was completely terrified of going to a federal penitentiary. He rambled incoherently about how the trial was a massive misunderstanding and his lawyers had failed him. He sobbed heavily, his chest heaving as he stared at the woman he had treated like an absolute burden. "Aaliyah, please, you have to help me," Deon begged, his voice cracking into a pathetic whimper. "I always loved you. I swear to you, I never meant for any of this to happen. I just lost my way and got caught up in the pressure of trying to be the perfect provider for us. I made some terrible financial mistakes, but I am still the man you married. I am still your husband, in the eyes of God. You know me better than anyone else in the world. And you know I do not belong in a cage with violent criminals. You have to save me, Aaliyah. I am begging you on my hands and knees." He stretched his chained hands across the table, desperately trying to reach my fingers. But I took a smooth, deliberate step backward, keeping myself entirely out of his physical reach. His weeping intensified when he realized his usual manipulative charm had absolutely no effect on my posture. He swallowed hard and finally revealed the true reason he had begged the marshals to grant him this brief meeting. "I need you to hire a high-tier federal appeals lawyer." Deon pleaded, his words spilling out in a rapid, panicked rush. "Vanguard Holdings has the liquid capital to secure the best legal defense team in the country. If you just write a check for my legal fees, we can get this conviction overturned on a technicality. I will do whatever you want. Aaliyah, I will sign whatever papers you need me to sign. I will spend the rest of my life making this up to you. Just please, do not let them take me away to a federal prison for the next 12 years. I will die in there." I stood perfectly still and simply looked down at the weeping, broken man sitting at the steel table. For 5 years, I had been deeply conditioned to manage his fragile emotions and soothe his volatile temper. I used to carefully monitor his moods, terrified of triggering his explosive rage. I had spent my entire marriage making myself as small and agreeable as possible, just to keep him comfortable. But as I stared at his tear-stained face and listened to his pathetic begging, I realized something profoundly liberating had shifted inside my chest. I felt absolutely nothing. I felt no lingering anger over his financial betrayal. I felt no sadness for the miserable life he was about to lead. Behind bars, I felt no sympathy for his tears, and no desire to seek any further vengeance. The deep, heavy trauma bond that had chained me to his narcissistic abuse was completely and permanently severed. He was no longer a towering monster who controlled my reality. He was just a sad, desperate criminal facing the exact consequences of his own monumental greed. The absolute emptiness I felt toward him was the ultimate form of closure. He had stripped away his own power the moment he decided his ego was more important than basic human decency. I looked at his shaking hands and realized I did not owe this man a single drop of my energy. I leaned forward slightly, resting my hands on the cold steel table. I looked directly into his red, swollen eyes, ensuring my voice was perfectly steady and entirely devoid of emotion. "I did not destroy you, Deon," I said, speaking slowly, so every single word would permanently brand itself into his memory. "I just stepped out of the way and let you destroy yourself. Have a nice life." I stood up straight, turned my back on him, and walked toward the heavy metal door. The silence in the holding room shattered as the reality of my departure set in. Deon realized his final desperate manipulation tactic had completely failed, and his wealthy safety net was walking out of his life forever. "Aaliyah, wait!" Deon screamed, his voice tearing through the concrete room. "Come back here! You cannot leave me like this! You owe me!" I did not pause my stride. The armed bailiff pulled the heavy door open for me, and I stepped out into the brightly lit courthouse hallway. I took a deep breath of the cool, indoor air. The thick steel door slammed shut behind me, cutting off the frantic, desperate screaming of the man I used to love. I walked down the long corridor, listening to the steady, confident click of my own heels against the floor. The heavy burden of my past was locked securely away in a basement holding cell, and I was finally walking toward a future that belonged entirely to me. The morning sun was already baking the Atlanta asphalt as my private driver pulled through the heavy wrought iron gates of the estate. The towering $3 million mansion stood completely silent at the top of the driveway, a stark contrast to the absolute chaos that had consumed it during the eviction party. The sprawling, manicured lawn was empty, but the massive circular driveway was currently occupied by 3 enormous industrial dumpsters. A team of 30 professional movers and demolition experts wearing heavy-duty work boots and thick canvas gloves stood waiting for my arrival. I stepped out of the vehicle, feeling the thick southern humidity against my skin. The air felt different today. The suffocating toxic energy that my ex-husband used to project across this entire property had been entirely eradicated. I walked slowly up the grand stone steps, pulling the heavy brass keys from my pocket. I unlocked the double mahogany doors and pushed them wide open. The massive grand foyer echoed with my footsteps, sounding incredibly hollow and barren. I turned to the burly foreman of the demolition crew who had followed me onto the porch and gave him a single sharp nod. The crew immediately flooded into the house like an organized military unit, bringing in heavy plastic bins, moving dollies, and sledgehammers. Instructed them to start with the master suite on the second floor and work their way down, ripping out every single item, tear out the custom silk curtains and smash that ridiculous imported mahogany desk he used to pretend he was working at. I commanded, my voice ringing clearly through the empty foyer. Throw the massive king-size bed into the dumpster and rip up the luxury carpets in his private dressing room. I want every single piece of furniture, every crystal decanter, every designer rug, and every trace of that pathetic man removed from this property by noon today. The physical destruction began almost immediately. The loud sounds of shattering glass, cracking wood, and heavy boots stomping across the hardwood floors filled the entire estate. It sounded like beautiful, chaotic music to my ears. I walked methodically through the lower levels, watching the muscular men carry out the heavy leather sofas where Deon used to sit and belittle my art gallery. I watched them dismantle the custom marble bar where his arrogant brother-in-law Connor used to swirl expensive whiskey and deliver his racist, condescending microaggressions. Every single object they threw into the massive steel dumpsters outside felt like a heavy, toxic weight being physically lifted directly off my chest. The physical act of stripping the house down to its bare architectural bones represented the total cleansing of my own internal spirit. I walked into the formal dining room and stared at the long, polished table where I had spent 5 agonizing years shrinking myself into a corner just to keep a deeply fragile man comfortable. I watched 2 workers grab the table by its edges and haul it out the front doors. The sound of the heavy wood scraping against the pavement outside symbolized the permanent breaking of my psychological chains. The house was being completely purged of the suffocating, pretentious lifestyle Deon had violently forced upon me. The walls were stripped of his gaudy, expensive art pieces, leaving behind a pristine blank canvas. The exhaustive cleansing process took 4 solid hours. The smell of fresh dust and sweat replacing the cloying scent of the expensive cologne Deon used to wear. The empty rooms suddenly looked absolutely massive, overflowing with pure, unadulterated potential. I stood alone in the exact center of the vast, empty living room, listening to the quiet, steady breathing of a house that finally belonged entirely to me, without any hidden strings attached. The sudden crunch of tires on gravel broke the peaceful silence. I walked out onto the front porch to see Elias stepping out of his sleek black town car, accompanied by an older, distinguished white man wearing a sharp, tailored suit. The older man was Marcus Sterling, a notoriously aggressive and highly successful rival real estate developer in the Buckhead area. He was the exact type of powerful corporate titan my ex-husband used to desperately idolize and endlessly beg for meetings with. Elias led the prominent developer up the stone steps, carefully navigating past the overflowing industrial dumpsters. They stepped into the completely gutted foyer. Marcus Sterling looked around the empty, sprawling space with a deeply calculating and hungry gaze. He walked slowly through the massive interconnected rooms, openly admiring the pristine structural bones of the estate and the incredibly lucrative location. He turned to me with a look of profound corporate respect. "This is an incredibly strategic and ruthless purge, Aaliyah," Marcus said, his deep voice echoing loudly in the empty room. "The property value in this specific zip code has absolutely skyrocketed over the last 3 fiscal quarters. You have a massive gold mine sitting right here, completely ready for a rapid, high-end flip. I am willing to offer you $6 million in pure liquid cash for the deed. Today, no inspections, no contingencies. We can close the deal and wire the funds by tomorrow morning." The massive offer hung in the air, literally doubling the original market value of the property. It was the exact kind of aggressive, lucrative deal my ex-husband would have literally begged on his hands and knees to secure just to prove his worth to the world. But I simply looked at the wealthy developer and felt absolutely no temptation. The money meant absolutely nothing to me compared to the profound vision I had already established for this specific piece of real estate. "I appreciate the very generous offer, Marcus," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level and commanding, "but this property is absolutely not for sale. It is never going to become another overpriced mansion for a fragile, arrogant man to lock his wife inside." I turned my attention to Elias, who immediately reached into his slim leather briefcase. He pulled out a thick legal document and rested it on a portable plastic folding table the moving crew had left behind. I signed the deed, transforming the $3 million estate into the permanent headquarters for a new nonprofit supporting financially abused women, giving them the exact legal and financial resources they absolutely need to rapidly rebuild their completely shattered lives. The weeks following the trial moved with a rapid and ruthless efficiency, leaving a trail of absolute devastation for the people who had spent half a decade trying to break my spirit. The universe has a highly specific way of balancing the scales, and I had a front row seat to watch the complete collapse of their unearned privilege. Patricia found herself standing on the cracked linoleum floor of a cramped one-bedroom apartment on the far outskirts of the city. The sprawling suburban retirement home she had secretly remortgaged to fund her son, and his fake billionaire lifestyle was completely gone, seized by the bank and auctioned off to the highest bidder. The woman who used to wear oversized sun hats and brag endlessly about her elite Atlanta pedigree was now surrounded by water-stained walls and peeling paint. She dragged a heavy cardboard box across the tiny living room, her tailored cream pantsuits replaced by cheap faded sweatpants. She unpacked a single chipped teacup, placing it on a scratched laminate counter she used to loudly mock my humble beginnings, telling anyone who would listen that I belonged in the hood, and now she was permanently trapped in the exact impoverished reality she had spent her entire life, aggressively looking down upon the suffocating heat of the air-conditioned apartment pressed against her skin, forcing her to finally understand the profound weight of true desperation. She sat on a stained thrift store mattress and wept for the luxury she would never experience again. Every single day was a brutal reminder of the son she enabled and the life she lost due to her own blind vanity. The prestigious social clubs revoked her membership, and her wealthy friends completely abandoned her, leaving her to face her miserable new existence entirely alone, without a single person to rely on for help or comfort. Jasmine suffered a similarly brutal descent into the harsh reality of the working class. The pampered sister-in-law who had stood in my circular driveway popping expensive champagne to celebrate my eviction was now wearing a stiff, uncomfortable polyester uniform. She worked the closing shift at a discount retail store in a dying strip mall. Her designer handbags and luxury vacations were nothing more than distant memories erased by the crushing debt her fleeing husband had dumped onto her shoulders. She stood behind the scratched plastic checkout counter, Her feet aching from standing on the hard concrete floor for 9 straight hours, a wealthy, arrogant customer approached the register, throwing a pile of wrinkled clothes onto the scanner. The customer snapped her fingers at Jasmine, demanding faster service and loudly insulting her intelligence. When the outdated cash register momentarily froze, Jasmine bit her lip, fighting back tears of intense humiliation as she was forced to swallow her pride and apologize to the rude woman. The utter degradation of serving entitled people who treated her exactly the way she used to treat me was the ultimate form of absolute karma. She was finally learning how the real world actually operated without her brother and his stolen money to shield her from consequence. She spent her breaks crying in the employee restroom, terrified of the mounting bills waiting for her at home. She was entirely alone, forced to navigate a financial nightmare. She had zero capability of handling the glamorous life she thought she was entitled to, had completely vanished, leaving a bitter, exhausted woman ringing up cheap merchandise. Connor did not fare any better. His desperate attempt to escape his financial ruin by fleeing the state had only delayed his inevitable destruction. The arrogant crypto investor who loved delivering condescending microaggressions while leaning against his leased Porsche had finally run completely out of luck and privilege. Federal investigators had spent months digging through his volatile business ventures, exposing a massive web of deceit that existed entirely separate from Deon and his Ponzi scheme. Connor was officially indicted by a federal grand jury for operating an unlicensed securities exchange and defrauding multiple private investors. His wealthy, connected family had completely disowned him, refusing to pay for his legal defense to protect their own logistics empire. He sat alone in a sterile county interrogation room wearing handcuffs as federal agents presented him with mountains of irrefutable evidence proving his massive crypto empire was nothing more than a pathetic digital illusion. He was no longer the smartest man in the room. He was just another arrogant fraud waiting to be processed into the federal prison system. His empty threats and corporate superiority had dissolved, leaving behind a coward facing decades of federal prosecution. His entire identity had been entirely erased by his own glaring incompetence. The men he used to swindle were now testifying against him to reduce their own sentences. And Connor realized he had absolutely no one left to manipulate. The heavy steel door of his jail cell closing shut was the final profound echo of a life built entirely on racism, entitlement, and massive financial deception. I watched these events unfold from a comfortable distance, feeling a profound sense of universal balance. I was sitting at the massive desk in my corner office, the Atlanta skyline stretching out endlessly behind me. The afternoon sun cast a warm golden glow across the architectural blueprints resting on my desk. I reached for my coffee mug, enjoying the absolute silence and perfect peace of my corporate sanctuary. My personal assistant knocked softly on the heavy glass door before stepping into the room. She held a sealed manila envelope carrying the official crest of the federal court system. She placed it gently on my desk and quietly backed out of the room. I picked up the silver letter opener and sliced through the thick paper, pulling out the single sheet of official court documentation. It was the finalized sentencing mandate from the federal judge regarding the criminal trial. The bold black text at the bottom of the page confirmed the absolute end of the nightmare. My phone buzzed, simultaneously displaying a secure email notification from Elias, confirming the exact same information. Deon and his legal fate had been permanently sealed. The judge had officially finalized his federal prison sentence, mandating a full 12 years behind bars, without any possibility of early parole. The cold, hard reality of his punishment was the perfect conclusion to a saga of immense greed and betrayal. The crisp autumn wind swept through the bustling streets of Buckhead as my driver pulled up to a massive industrial photography studio. The heavy steel doors opened, revealing a chaotic symphony of bright, flashing lights, rushing production assistants, and towering reflective umbrellas. I stepped out of the vehicle wearing a striking crimson tailored suit that perfectly commanded the vast room. The days of hiding my light to keep a fragile man comfortable were completely and permanently over. The creative director of Forbes magazine rushed forward to greet me with eager enthusiasm, offering me a glass of sparkling water and guiding me toward the pristine white backdrop. The makeup artist dusted a final layer of powder across my cheekbones, while the lead photographer adjusted his heavy camera lens, giving me a look of profound professional respect. Today was the exact day I officially stepped out of the protective shadows and publicly claimed my massive corporate empire. The loud, rhythmic clicking of the camera shutter echoed through the studio as I struck a series of powerful, commanding poses, projecting the absolute, undeniable authority of a woman who fully owned her entire destiny. I did not smile softly or try to make myself appear small and approachable. I stared directly into the blinding camera lens, channeling every single ounce of the relentless business acumen that had secretly built Vanguard Holdings from the ground up. The senior journalist sat across from me in a quiet, glass-enclosed lounge, her digital voice recorder resting on the sleek table between us. She asked penetrating, highly intelligent questions about my aggressive acquisition strategies and my unparalleled success in the notoriously male-dominated private equity sector. I answered every single inquiry with effortless precision, officially confirming my identity as the sole visionary force operating behind the scenes of Atlanta. Most lucrative real estate transactions for half a decade. I allowed an arrogant, toxic man to act as the public face of my grandfather, incredible legacy, simply because society teaches Black women to shrink themselves to protect the fragile egos of the men they love. I explained, my voice carrying a steady melodic rhythm, but true generational wealth cannot be built on a foundation of silence and submission. I am reclaiming my narrative today to completely change the industry landscape for other young Black female entrepreneurs who are currently sitting in the shadows, terrified of outshining their partners. I want them to look at the cover of this magazine and realize they never actually needed a frontman to validate their absolute brilliance. The journalist furiously typed on her laptop, completely captivated by the raw, unfiltered truth pouring out of my mouth. I detailed exactly how Vanguard Holdings was actively restructuring its entire investment portfolio to heavily fund minority-owned startups, completely disrupting the traditional funding networks that constantly gatekeep Black excellence. The interview lasted for 2 exhilarating hours, and when it finally concluded, the journalist shook my hand with a profound sense of awe, thanking me for delivering the most groundbreaking cover story of the entire fiscal year. I walked out of the studio, feeling an overwhelming sense of liberation radiating through my entire body. The publication date was scheduled for early next month, and the corporate shockwaves were going to permanently alter the entire financial hierarchy of Atlanta. My driver navigated the bustling city traffic, taking me back to my towering executive office building. The glass doors of my private suite opened smoothly, granting me access to the immaculate sanctuary I had built entirely for myself. I walked over to my massive mahogany desk, pouring a fresh glass of iced lemon water. My executive assistant knocked quietly on the open doorframe, holding a silver tray stacked perfectly with the afternoon mail deliveries. She placed the stack gently on the corner of my desk, flashing me a warm, respectful smile before retreating back to her reception station. I sifted slowly through the assorted documents, glancing at high-end real estate proposals, elite charity, gala invitations, and encrypted legal briefs from Elias. Everything on my desk represented wealth, power, and total independence. Until I reached the very bottom of the heavy stack, my fingers brushed against a remarkably cheap, thin white envelope. It felt completely out of place. Among the thick luxury stationery resting on my desk, I pulled the envelope out and stared at the return address stamped aggressively into the top left corner. The crude black ink indicated it was sent directly from the United States Federal Penitentiary Facility, located 2 states away. My heart did not skip a single beat. My breathing remained perfectly steady and composed. I looked at the messy, desperate handwriting scrawled furiously across the front of the cheap paper. It was definitely from Deon. He had somehow managed to scrape together enough commissary funds to buy a single stamp and a piece of paper to beg for my attention. From behind his iron bars, the man who used to throw $100 bills at my feet was now reduced to begging a prison guard to mail a pathetic letter to the very woman he had viciously tried to discard. I did not even bother reaching for my silver letter opener. I had absolutely no desire to read his pathetic apologies, his manipulative lies, or his desperate pleas for an expensive appeals lawyer. His words held zero value. In my current reality, I turned my head slowly, looking directly at the large decorative mirror hanging on the far wall of my office, catching my own fierce reflection. I maintained unblinking eye contact with myself, admiring the powerful, unstoppable woman staring back at me. I held the thin white envelope over the heavy-duty industrial shredder, sitting discreetly beside my desk. My steady fingers simply let go of the thick paper, allowing gravity to pull his desperate final words down into the hungry spinning metal blades. The loud, mechanical whirring sound filled the quiet office, instantly shredding his letter into hundreds of meaningless, tiny pieces. I watched the machine completely devour the torn paper without feeling a single ounce of remorse, breaking my eye contact with the mirror. I turned away from the shredder and walked back toward the massive windows. Looking out over the beautiful, thriving city, I had officially conquered. I took a deep, long breath, feeling completely alive and entirely ready to continue aggressively building my beautiful, massive, unstoppable financial empire. The transition from the stark corporate office to the vibrant energy of my new Buckhead penthouse was seamless. The sprawling, multi-level residence was a masterpiece of modern architecture, featuring soaring glass walls that offered an unobstructed 360-degree view of the glowing Atlanta skyline. I stood in the center of the massive entertainment space, watching my event coordination team finalize the intricate details for the inaugural Vanguard Holdings Charity Gala. The atmosphere was buzzing with authentic purpose, completely devoid of the suffocating, pretentious anxiety that used to poison the fake high society dinners my ex-husband forced me to endure. I glided across the polished marble floor, wearing a breathtaking custom emerald gown that flowed around my body like liquid silk. It was the exact same color as the robe his desperate mistress had worn on the night of my eviction. But tonight, the color represented my absolute financial sovereignty and undeniable rebirth. My personal styling team stepped back to admire their flawless work as I fastened a delicate diamond necklace around my throat. There was no heavy toxic energy weighing down my shoulders. Tonight, I was surrounded entirely by people who respected my brilliant mind and celebrated my massive corporate achievements without feeling threatened by my immense power. The private elevator chimed softly, signaling the continual arrival of my distinguished guests. The polished steel doors slid open repeatedly, revealing a spectacular crowd of authentic, influential leaders from across the entire state. There were absolutely no shady crypto investors desperately looking for a quick, unearned handout, and no entitled manipulative relatives demanding unearned respect. The vast room rapidly filled with brilliant Black female entrepreneurs, dedicated community, philanthropists, and razor-sharp legal minds who genuinely understood the profound value of building true generational wealth. Elias stepped out of the elevator wearing a pristine, meticulously tailored tuxedo, holding a crystal glass of premium vintage champagne. He navigated through the sophisticated crowd with effortless grace, stopping right beside me to deliver a warm, deeply respectful smile. The air was incredibly thick with genuine celebration and undeniable, breathtaking Black excellence. The live jazz band played a smooth, melodic rhythm in the far corner of the expansive room, creating a perfectly curated ambiance. I walked through the elegant crowd, exchanging warm embraces and highly intelligent corporate strategies with my esteemed colleagues. Nobody asked me about simple flower arrangements or condescendingly belittled my professional capabilities. They asked me about massive commercial real estate acquisitions and complex federal market regulations. I was no longer shrinking myself down to fit inside the tiny, suffocating box of a fragile man. and his pathetic insecurities, I was finally taking up the exact amount of massive space I truly deserved, dominating the luxurious room with my undeniable presence and actively shaping the entire financial landscape of the city. According to my own highly specific vision, the catering staff circulated silently through the massive penthouse, offering exquisite culinary creations to the highly engaged guests. I watched the beautiful, thriving ecosystem I had personally cultivated and felt a deep, profound sense of absolute peace. This was not a desperate, chaotic attempt to prove my worth to people who inherently hated me. This was a magnificent celebration of survival and ruthless corporate triumph. I thought briefly about the empty, cold mansion where this entire ordeal had originally started. That massive property had already been fully converted into the thriving operational headquarters for a domestic abuse nonprofit, providing urgent, critical resources to hundreds of vulnerable women. The dark, painful roots of my past had been permanently ripped out of the ground and replaced with a powerful, growing forest of genuine community support. I stood near the edge of the sprawling outdoor terrace, letting the cool evening breeze wash over my face. The glittering city, lights stretched out endlessly below my feet, looking like a vast, glowing ocean of endless possibility. The intense trauma of the eviction, the massive financial betrayals, and the racist microaggressions from a deeply entitled white brother-in-law felt like they belonged to an entirely different lifetime. I had completely shed the skin of the quiet, submissive wife, leaving the discarded pieces of that fake identity locked away in a federal holding cell. I was a self-made titan, an untouchable force of nature who absolutely refused to be broken by the monumental greed of a deeply flawed and pathetic man. The soft chiming of a silver spoon against a crystal champagne flute instantly quieted the lively chatter of the massive room. Elias stood near the grand, glossy piano, signaling for the full attention of the distinguished guests. The crowd turned toward me, their faces reflecting nothing but pure, unadulterated respect and genuine admiration. I stepped up onto the slightly elevated marble platform holding my own glass of vintage champagne. The entire room fell into a beautiful, expectant silence, waiting for the chief executive officer of Vanguard Holdings to officially address her empire. I looked out at the sea of brilliant, supportive faces, making direct eye contact with the exceptional men and women who had stood by my side during the absolute darkest moments of my massive corporate transition. I did not need a written speech or a highly rehearsed corporate script. The raw, unfiltered truth flowed naturally from my chest, carrying the heavy, profound weight of my entire personal and professional journey. I raised my glass slightly higher, the multifaceted crystal catching the warm, ambient light of the magnificent penthouse chandelier. Someone once told me to take my personal belongings and leave. I projected my voice clearly and smoothly across the silent room, letting the heavy words echo beautifully against the soaring glass windows. So I did exactly what I was told. I took my absolute dignity, my massive corporate empire, and my unbreakable peace of mind. Empty houses tell absolutely no lies, but they sure do make phenomenal, rock-solid foundations for a real, unstoppable empire. The entire room erupted into a deafening roar of genuine applause and overwhelming support. The jazz band instantly transitioned into a triumphant, soaring melody that perfectly captured the magnificent, triumphant energy of the night. I brought the delicate crystal flute to my lips and took a slow, celebratory sip of the crisp, chilled champagne. The incredibly sweet taste of absolute victory washed over my tongue. I turned my body slowly away from the cheering crowd and walked right up to the edge of the floor-to-ceiling glass windows. I rested my hand gently against the cool, smooth surface and gazed out over the sprawling, glowing infrastructure of the massive, beautiful city I now completely and permanently owned fade to black. The story of Aaliyah, as chronicled in the provided account, serves as far more than a dramatic tale of revenge or a narrative of marital dissolution. It is a profound, albeit cautionary exploration of the human psyche, the illusory nature of status, and the absolute necessity of financial autonomy in the face of systematic psychological and emotional abuse. At its core, the narrative is an allegory for the struggle to maintain one's self-worth when surrounded by environments that are designed, either intentionally or through systemic neglect, to diminish silence and eventually discard the individual. 1. To understand the lessons within this story, one must first deconstruct the character of Deon. He represents the archetype of the fragile ego, a man whose entire identity is constructed not on personal achievement, but on the need for external validation and dominance. His cruelty toward Aaliyah was not a byproduct of his success, but a prerequisite for it. He required a lesser partner to mirror his own desired superiority. This is a common pattern in abusive relationships. The abuser projects their own insecurities, failures, and feelings of inadequacy onto the partner, effectively gaslighting them into believing they are the low-ambition party. The lesson here is that an abuser's insults are rarely descriptions of the victim. They are confessions of the abuser's own internal emptiness. When Deon called Aaliyah trash or a low-ambition artist, he was describing the version of himself he was terrified of becoming, someone who had no substance, only appearance. 1. The second and perhaps most critical lesson involves the distinction between perceived power and actual power. Deon's world was a house of cards. He moved in circles that valued the aesthetic of wealth, tailored suits, designer robes, and champagne over the substance of it. He treated the mansion he rented as if he owned it, and he treated his wife as if he were her benefactor. This is a vital lesson on the nature of keeping up appearances. In modern society, particularly in high-stakes corporate and social environments, it is remarkably easy to confuse access with ownership and reputation with reality. Deon was in effect a tenant in his own life, while Aaliyah, by maintaining her financial independence and her quiet, disciplined control over Vanguard Holdings, possessed the ultimate, unassailable power, the ability to set the terms of reality. 1. The story also offers a searing critique of enablers. The roles played by Patricia, Jasmine, and Connor are perhaps even more illuminating than Deon's own villainy. They did not abuse Aaliyah directly, at least not in the same physical or financial manner as Deon, but they provided the social architecture that allowed the abuse to thrive. They were the audience. They cheered for Deon because his performance of wealth benefited them. They drank the champagne, wore the clothes, and enjoyed the reflected glow of his success. The lesson here is clear: complicity is an active choice. When individuals choose to ignore the suffering of others for the sake of their own comfort, they are not neutral parties. They are architects of the toxic environment. The complete collapse of the lives of Patricia, Jasmine, and Connor, their descent into poverty and ruin, underscores the idea that a foundation built on someone else's pain is inherently unstable. Furthermore, Aaliyah's journey provides a masterclass in the power of emotional regulation. Throughout the ordeal, from the moment Deon handed her the divorce papers to the moment she had him served during his own engagement party, Aaliyah remained profoundly, almost chillingly composed. Many would argue that her calm was cold, but in the context of her reality, it was survival. She had learned through 5 years of being minimized that reacting to an abuser's provocation is exactly what they want. It validates their power. By refusing to scream, cry, or engage in the petty back and forth they craved, she denied them the fuel they needed to feel powerful. She understood that true strength is not found in the volume of one's voice, but in the certainty of one's position. Her composure was not indifference. It was the absolute focused clarity of a woman who knew the truth of her situation. She did not need to shout because she had the deed. 1. The narrative also shifts the paradigm of financial literacy. Aaliyah's grandfather built an empire and she inherited it, but she did not let that inheritance define her or make her lazy. She continued to run her gallery, she continued to work, and she continued to grow her own understanding of the world. She understood that money without discipline is a liability, not an asset. Deon, by contrast, treated money as a magic wand, something to be waved to create an image, rather than a tool to be managed to create security. The catastrophic failure of his Ponzi scheme and the subsequent liquidation of his assets serve as a stark reminder that wealth is not merely about the accumulation of cash, but the management of responsibility. 1. Finally, the story brings us to the concept of the harvest. Aaliyah famously mused, "He thought he had buried me, but he had merely planted me in my own soil. Now it was time for the harvest." This is perhaps the most empowering sentiment in the entire account. Adversity in many forms is often described as being buried. It is dark, heavy, and isolating, but Aaliyah's perspective flips this. She recognizes that the very obstacles Deon placed in her path, the attempt to humiliate her, the eviction, the public mockery, were not barriers, but the environment she needed to bloom. She used the very tools of her suppression, the house, the legal structures, the public setting, to facilitate her liberation. The conclusion of the story, where Aaliyah converts the mansion into a non-profit for financially abused women, is the final definitive lesson. Revenge, as many before her have discovered, is a hollow victory. It satisfies the ego, but it does not nourish the spirit. True power lies in the ability to pivot from destruction to creation. By using the property that was once a cage to build a sanctuary for others, Aaliyah transformed her trauma into a public good. She did not just move on, she repurposed the wreckage of her past to build a better future for those who were where she once was. 1. In summary, the life lessons to be gleaned from this story are multifaceted. First, never underestimate the strength of those who are forced to play small for the sake of peace. They are often the most capable of great quiet expansion. Second, financial independence is not merely about comfort. It is a fundamental pillar of personal agency and security. Third, surround yourself with people who value your substance, not the status you can provide. Those who benefit from your downfall will always be the first to turn against you when your fortunes shift. And lastly, do not fear being buried. If you possess the seeds of integrity and vision, the dark places of your life will be the very soil in which you eventually grow the strongest. The ultimate victory is not in proving your abuser wrong, but in building a life so full, so authentic, and so anchored in your own truth that your abuser's opinion ceases to exist entirely. This narrative challenges the reader to look at their own relationships, their own financial habits, and their own self-image. It asks, are you building a structure of truth, or are you merely renting space in a reality you do not control? It invites us to be the architects of our own destinies, ensuring that when the harvest comes, it is a bounty of our own making, not a wreckage of someone else's greed. Are you ready to stop renting your life to the expectations of others and start building your own foundation of power? Start by auditing your financial independence and mental boundaries today. Take one step toward owning your narrative, because true freedom begins the moment you decide to stop playing small.